Welcome, Gunrunner.
Ever since the first consoles arrived on the market, the Pac-Man game has been a mainstay. In fact, the importance of the Pac-Man game is quite understated, as getting this right has proved to make or break the demand for a system, especially during its launch period. Atari were probably the first to understand this when they decided that combat would be the perfect Pac-Man for their video computer system. They were promoting the console as the perfect addition to your living room, the perfect companion for your new colour TV, and something that could be enjoyed by all the family. So giving away a cartridge that was totally focused on multiplayer gameplay with easy pick up and play qualities was undoubtedly the right decision. In later years it was Nintendo who knew what to do when they included Super Mario Bros. With their entertainment system. It was the must-have game of the era, so that made the NES the must-have system for people across North America in particular. Sega were a bit slower to pick up on this, but began to get things right when they built Alice Kid in Miracle World into the Master System. I'm sure everyone out there has their own favourite pack-ins. For me, I will never forget the inclusions of Centipede with my Atari 2600 Junior, Streets of Rage and Sonic with my Sega Mega Drive, and Cybermorph with my Atari Jaguar. The first game you play on a new system always makes a big impression on you, and alters your perception of the console going forward. But it's fair to say that console manufacturers didn't always get things right, and there were some occasions where they got things drastically wrong. Not just sticking in a lacklustre title, but one that downright stank and in some cases very much contributed to the failure of said system. And in this video we're going to be looking at 5 such examples of this idiocy.
First the Pac-Man eats through a maze of dots, then the Pac-Man heads for the corner spot, then he eats his fill of a power pill, and then all those ghosts turn blue, boo, and Pac-Man eats them all too.
Have you played Pac-Man? It's the new video computer game everyone's talking about, and naturally, it's from Atari.
Have you played Atari today?
I mentioned in the intro how combat was the perfect pack-in for the Atari video computer system, very much promoting the family-focused nature of the system. But the game that replaced combat as the pack-in cartridge is a very different story. That game, of course, was the infamous Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man. Now you may think that the reason for including this game was name recognition alone. I mean, back in the early 80s everyone knew about Pac-Man and his pill-popping exploits. But the actual reason Pac-Man replaced combat as the Pac-In title is a lot less intelligent. You see, alongside another infamous Atari 2600 game in E.T., Pac-Man was an expensive license for Atari, and they were banking on it producing a huge surge in demand for their console. So the bosses at Warner Brothers decided to produce more cartridges than consoles that already existed, leaving them a huge stockpile of cartridges that only got bigger when people discovered just how lacklustre Todd Fry's conversion was. So to help shift this huge pile of inventory, Atari started including Pac-Man as the Pac-In game, where it remained so throughout the life of the slightly remodelled black-fronted version of the console that was the first to be officially known as the Atari 2600 and affectionately nicknamed the Vader, after the famous Star Wars villain. The first genuine contender to the Atari 2600 in the console arena was Mattel's Intellivision, not just because it was backed by the huge financial muscle of the famous toy company, but also due to its much more advanced technology. But high-resolution graphics, a 16-bit CPU, and a proper sound chip means absolutely nothing without the games to show that technology off. But for some reason Mattel didn't want to do that, and decided that Las Vegas Poker and Blackjack was the perfect pack-in for their new console. As the name suggests, it's a computerized version of 2 popular card games in poker and blackjack. It included 7-card stud and 5-card draw, as well as variable bets and both 1 and 2 player variations. Okay, it was far from a terrible game. In fact, it was a pretty decent approximation of the subject matter for the era. But there's absolutely no doubting that it was a terrible pack-in, especially at a time when its big rival, the Atari 2600, was starting to receive big-name titles like Superman, Adventure and Space Invaders. Looking at the launch lineup for the Intellivision, Armour Battle would have been a much better choice, not only because it was Mattel's answer to Atari's Combat, but also because it featured vast visual improvements. So anyone that would have seen the console side by side in a store would have no doubt chosen the Mattel console if they were looking at the included games alone, which were more often than not the game playing in the demo unit in the store, of course. Thankfully, Mattel learned from this mistake, and later Intellivision bundles included the cult classic Astro Smash and also an excellent conversion of the Data East arcade game Burger Time. Now, in the intro to this video, I spoke about several times where console companies picked the perfect pack-in for their respective machines. But there was one big one from the earlier years of the industry that I didn't mention, the ColecoVision combined with Donkey Kong. Coleco stealing the Donkey Kong license from under the noses of Atari was a huge coup for the company, and they rightly boasted about it. And what better way is there to rub it in the faces of your biggest rival than making sure it was the first game everyone got to play on their new system. The ColecoVision offered a huge leap from the Atari 2600 in both graphics and sound, and the conversion of Donkey Kong very much proved that. It offered up an almost arcade-perfect approximation of the hugely popular Nintendo arcade game, and when compared to the laughable Atari 2600 version, delivered by Coleco themselves of course, it was clear to see what the superior system was. So when Coleco chose to launch their own Atari 2600 compatible console in the form of the Gemini, in order to further cut into their rivals' leading market share, they figured that Donkey Kong would be the perfect pack-in yet again. Only, as I already mentioned, the Atari 2600 conversion of Donkey Kong was horrible, with its fat Mario, laughable Kong and paltry 2 levels. It was so bad that many people speculated it had been botched on purpose to increase the attraction of Coleco's own console. After many people laughed and pointed at the terrible decision to bundle 2600 Donkey Kong with the Gemini, Coleco hastily bunged Mousetrap into the box too, and slapped on a new sticker. Okay, the port of the XD arcade game didn't offer the same level of name recognition as the Nintendo game, but it was certainly a lot more playable. In many ways, the start of this list follows a console timeline. First, there was the Atari 2600, then its first big rival, the Intellivision, and I also talked about the big contender to both these consoles, the ColecoVision. So it's only right that the next console I talk about is Atari's answer to the more advanced technology offered up by its rivals, the Atari 5200 Super System. Now, I'm sure you're already aware that the big brutish 5200 was in fact nothing more than a consolised version of Atari's groundbreaking Atari 400 computer, with a pair of dodgy analog joysticks and a wider cartridge port. And I'm sure that you're already aware that the Atari 400 and its higher spec sibling, the Atari 800, were home to some of the finest home computer games of the era, like Pac-Man, Space Invaders and Star Raiders. So with a wealth of titles to already choose from, it must have been a tough decision to decide which big name title to include with the 5200. Well, you'd certainly think that anyway, but I can only assume that the game was just drawn out of a hat, because the result was Super Breakout. Now before you start, yes, Breakout and its Super sequel are genuine classics, and yes, it's a decent conversion of the game too, but you have to take off the rose-tinted specs and look at this for the time period. At this point, the ColecoVision came with Donkey Kong, and the Intellivision came bundled with Burger Time, both bona fide arcade blockbusters of the era. So a conversion of a game that first appeared in arcades some 6 years before, in 1976, and then became a launch title for the Atari 400 and 800 in 1979, was not going to cut the mustard in 1982. It was already old hat, and not a game that people would pay top dollar to play. By the time the first revision of the 5200 arrived less than a year later, Super Breakout had indeed been replaced with the excellent port of Pac-Man for the console. But the damage had already been done, and with the industry imploding in the form of the North American video game crash, plans had already been put in place to replace the failed 5200 with the Atari 7800 Pro system. You can't help but think that had Atari included Pac-Man, Space Invaders, or indeed the groundbreaking Star Raiders with the 5200 at launch, we would be talking about the console in a much more positive light today. This final entry is quite different to all the others on this list, not just because it was one of the system's most awaited games at launch, but also because Sega actually tried to make reparations for their huge mistake, as I'll go on to explain. From the moment that Saturn was announced, people got excited about conversions of the company's latest state-of-the-art arcade games. Titles like Virtua Racing, Daytona USA, and of course Virtua Fighter were all eating coins across the world in coin-op form, and arcade-perfect conversions were promised for the 32-bit Saturn console. But I think it's fair to say that none of these went to plan. Ignoring the absolute train wreck that was the Saturn launch, I'd be here all day if we started talking about that, we never got Virtua Racing, which ended up being palmed off to Time Warner Interactive, the port of Daytona had horrible borders, numerous glitches and a poor frame rate, and then we had the pack-in game Virtua Fighter. Despite Sega's new 32-bit console offering more power than both the Virtua Fighter arcade board and the Mega Drive 32X add-on that already sported a pretty spiffing version of the game, the Saturn version certainly didn't show it. The comparisons got even worse when people looked over to the rival Sony PlayStation and its own 3D fighter offering, Battle Arena Toshinden, with its stunning texture-mapped polygons. Virtua Fighter looked primitive in comparison, and Sony capitalised on this by comparing the two games at every given opportunity. Rather than just bury their heads in the sand though, Sega attempted some damage control by quickly developing a new version of the game known as Virtua Fighter Remix. Whilst it was essentially the same game, it boasted a much higher polygon count, numerous gameplay tweaks, and most importantly of all, full texture mapping, bringing the game much closer to the new standard set by Battle Arena Toshinden. To rectify their mistake and keep existing Saturn owners happy, Sega offered free copies of Virtua Fighter Remix to anyone in North America who officially registered their console with them. Sadly for Sega, this was just the first of many mistakes they were going to make with the Saturn that would ultimately lead to its downfall, but at least we got a bloody amazing port of Virtua Fighter 2 though, eh?
1994年、それは遥か土星で開発された。64ビット級ゲームマシンセガサターン地球新発売。Sega。サターンニュース。これが次世代リアルファイトの実力だ。今までにない64ビット級コンピューターグラフィクス格闘技。早いんだよ。バーチャファイターセガサターンから。Sega。
And that rounds up my look at 5 terrible console pack-ins. Can you think of any other examples of bad games that came bundled with home consoles? Or do you think I was a little bit unfair with any of my inclusions? I also love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons that continue to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Mitchell Valentino, Neptune, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Dos Gamerman, Tiago Piera dos Santos Silva, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now, where you can get access to a host of extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights, and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.